there is no way that we can get emergency action unless you tell people that there's danger. And every emergency message about fires, floods, tsunamis that you have ever heard involves, and the coronavirus involves, telling people that there's a danger, telling them what that danger is, and telling them what to do. And there's never a single person that advises, don't tell people the truth, don't scare people when it's an actual emergency.
So for now, I will just introduce the two speakers today. So we have Margaret Klein Salaman, hope I'm pronouncing that right, who's a clinical psychologist, founder of the climate mobilization in the United States, and author of Facing the Climate Emergency, How to Transform Yourself with Climate Truth. And so really looking forward to hearing from her. And we have our local Jane Morton, who's a clinical psychologist, an Extinction Rebellion activist, and author of Don't Mention the Emergency. And so they're going to be giving this presentation, Living in Climate Truth, about climate emergency psychology. And I think without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jane.
So the original idea of this was to be a presentation to the Climate Action Network Australia, the large groups. And I don't know, now that it's 9 o'clock in the morning, how many are more like grassroots climate activists and how many are actually from those large groups. But this presentation I'm about to do is really, it's sort of a plea to the large organisations and small ones as well, everybody, to just tell the truth. It's the first essential ingredients for getting an emergency response. So I've got a presentation, I think it'll take about 10 minutes, going through some of the psychology research on this. Okay, so one of the things we know very well these days is that there's a lot of lies and misinformation. That's an obvious obstacle to getting the emergency action that we need. But I have a feeling there's a more subtle disinformation campaign that goes on actually about the climate messaging as well. And I'll just give you this as an example. So Frank Luntz is somebody who's been a very well-known Republican pollster and push pollster, really. So back in the time of George Bush, he advised the Republicans to always say climate change, not global warming, because global warming scares people. And he advised them to go hard on the science. The scientific debate is closing against us, but not yet closed. You need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. Okay, so look what he said later on. This is the advice that Obama took up. It was to not mention the science, to just talk about jobs, 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 clean energy, energy independence. And it's what Obama did. It's also what the climate movement in America took up, large parts of it anyway. And I think it was disastrous. Was he well-intentioned? Did he intend to mislead, or did he actually believe what he was saying? I don't know. He's come around now in recent times saying, well, that at least he does recognise that we've got a global warming problem. But I think his heart might have always been on the other side. But I think this message, this don't mention the emergency, fear doesn't work message, got into the American climate movement through him, through Obama, through the respect people had for the Obama campaign, and through there to Australia. That's the theory. So one obstacle is straight out lies, and we just don't know about whether that's a straight out lie or not. Another has been scientific reticence, that scientists are reluctant to speak out. When they speak out in ways that people can't understand. Fortunately, now we have people like James Hansen, who's been trying to speak out for years and years and years, who's now willing to actually get arrested as a way of making a stronger statement. But we still have a big problem, even with scientists. And this is Kevin Anderson, again, a very eminent scientist who's speaking out, saying about the difference between what scientists are saying when the microphone's in front of them and what they say when the microphone's off. And he says that for many years, those who've been telling him that there's no chance of staying over 2 degrees, that ship has sailed, now they're getting up and saying that we can still stay under 1.5 degrees of warming. And he is quite passionately speaking out. He's done a number of articles and presentations recently on this, just saying that this has got to stop, because this is a graph, but it's all these different emissions trajectories here. And what it's basically showing is that it doesn't really matter. Even if we do radical cuts in negative emissions in the second half of the century, we hit 1.5 degrees of warming at 2030. And 2 degrees, well, not that much later, unless we do something really dramatic. So the people who are going, oh, we need to tell, the Premier, we need to tell the government we want cuts consistent with 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees of warming is barely possible these days. So unless you say that it's an emergency and nothing but the strongest, almost inconceivable emergency action will save us, don't talk about 1.5 degrees. This is at least a climate scientist who is speaking out in public. And she says, look, people come and say, they, give us some hope. She doesn't have any. What she says is we need courage, not hope. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. We need more of this, honesty from the scientists. Okay, so one of the journalists who is speaking out is David Wallace-Wells, and he wrote an article back in 2017, I think it was, The Uninhabitable Earth. Got a lot of flack from climate scientists and climate campaigners that he was being alarmist. But he says if there's even a 1% chance that we've set off a chain reaction that could end the human race, it's something the public should know about. Of course they should be told. It's ridiculous. So one of the things that stands in the way of this is what I call cherry-picking the psychology. We hate it when climate change deniers and the fossil fuel industry cherry-pick the science, but we've seen cherry-picking of the psychology. All of us probably remember Al Gore, and particularly this very visual moment in his presentation of The Inconvenient Truth, where he gets up on the forklift thing to be able to reach that graph, which is the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, to very visually point out just how far outside anything in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years what we've got now is. He wasn't worried about telling the truth and making people afraid, and it worked really well. It moved the political debate. But what came along after that? A lot of just single studies that got stacks and stacks of coverage. There's one called Fear Won't Do It, with really weak methodology, tiny little samples, and even then the findings were misreported, because actually it turned out the fear worked fine as long as you added proportionate action. It's listed in the IPC summary of relevant messaging research. Can you believe that? This is one that got quoted all over the press. Apocalypse soon. Dire messages reduce belief in global warming by contradicting just world beliefs. Okay, so a lot of people only read the title or the summary. It's a sample of 97 university students who were doing it for course credit. And unless you actually contact the authors, you didn't get to find out that the two messages they were testing, one of them said, the IPCC says the science is really dire, and scientists say there is nothing we can do about it. The positive message was the IPCC says the science is really dire, and scientists say there's maybe something we can do about it. It was a most inaccurate test. One of the questions they asked was, after you read this, do you trust climate scientists sort of more or less? Well, they just read something that said climate scientists says there's nothing we can do, which wasn't actually true. It's a terrible, terrible study. Again, it's recommended in IPCC messaging advice. Out in 2012 came a report that was spread all over the climate movement in Australia, probably around the world, called Sizzle, the New Climate Message. It was based on the views of a salesman, Elmer Wheeler, and look, I've got no problem with basing stuff on salespeople because they actually do know what works. They get a test every time they run an advertising campaign of what works and what doesn't. But again, he was misreported. In his training, what he says is sell the sizzle, don't sell the steak. What he's trying to get across is that you sell on emotion, you don't sell on facts. Now, there's no doubt about that. That is totally correct. it was distorted in this climate messaging booklet to turn into a don't mention the emergency, fear doesn't work. The booklet actually wavers backwards and forwards at one point saying that bit that I've got quoted there, that talking about climate hell doesn't work. Later on they say, well, you've got to sell a vision first and then talk about a choice between hell and heaven and then talk about action. So it's a very confused message, but it's based on no science, and it's misrepresents even the salesman who's supposedly it's based on. So what we do know from the public health research is that, of course, fear works fine. So there was already in 2000 a meta-analysis of 98 public health studies which showed that the stronger the threat, the fear, and the susceptibility, the personally relevant threat, the more you get behaviour change. Not surprising. But you need to link it with something they can do. If you keep smoking, you could die, but you can quit. Every public health campaign, just about every public health campaign, uses this formula. Because why? It works. A more recent one in 2015, which addressed the backfire controversy. Again, finding that fear appeals are effective and there are no identified circumstances under which they would backfire. These meta-analyses, though, you never hardly ever hear them being talked about. You hear these single cherry-picked studies. It's also worth noting that people are actually already scared. This comes from a study that was a survey of 2,000 people, proportionate sample across US, UK, Canada and Australia. And even by 2015, I imagine the numbers are higher now, there's a large percentage of the population who believes that we're in a very dire circumstance. So if you're a campaigner and you refuse to talk about these things, all that you do is make people not trust you. One of the things that happens when I do heading for extinction talks for Extinction Rebellion is that there are young people in the audience and they say, I've been afraid about this stuff my whole life. I've been worrying about this since primary school. I have not engaged with politics because nobody cares, nobody's doing anything. I have not engaged with the large environmental groups because they just don't talk about it in a way that's truthful and they don't have answers that are going to do anything. So what we need is tell people the truth, even if it makes people afraid. Help people find the courage to act. And Margaret obviously is one of these people who has been telling the truth. And I think the exciting thing is that as you start to tell the truth, big things happen. So I hope Margaret will talk about this more, but within months, I believe, of the climate mobilisation starting in the US, with what seemed to even me like a very hard ask, a World War II scale mobilisation, within months they had managed to shift the Bernie Sanders campaign from we want a carbon tax to we want a World War II scale mobilisation. Amazing. And that's gone in then to the climate justice Green New Deal narrative that now is just all over the world as a perfectly acceptable idea, an emergency transition. We had a similar experience in Australia when the reef bleached in 2016 and there was a terrible spike in warming, a monthly global average temperature, which was actually 1.65 degrees warmer. We started a campaign to declare a climate emergency, and that was our wording, which we took all over the place as a petition. It seems to work very well. I won't go through it if you just want to read that. And it's basically threat plus action. The thing was that even though we were just using a petition, we were petitioning for the declaration of a climate emergency, and the response we got from the public was basically relief. Yes, of course the government should declare an emergency. Why are they not doing anything? So it took off much faster than we expected. We were asking candidates in council elections whether they pledged to support the declaration of a climate emergency. We tried it in Darebin, my local council. We got almost half the council candidates to support the declaration of a climate emergency, and we got 6 out of 9 on the council supporting it. very first council meeting, they became the first council in the world to declare a climate emergency. And now I believe it's about 1,800 councils in quite a few countries. But it started from telling the truth and something that approximated a proportionate response, declare an emergency. Of course, wonderful Greta, she started as one person outside the Swedish Parliament in 2018. At the most recent school strike, I think it was 7 million all around the world. And she's famous for her strong language. This is her "How dare you" speech. Extinction Rebellion, same thing. What a name, Extinction Rebellion, strongest possible messaging. Started in 2018, now in 68 countries. So I think I rest my case. Strong messaging is the key, but you have an ethical and moral obligation to tell the truth at this point in history where it's our last chance.
Does that mean it's my turn?
Over to you.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks Jane for having me. This is really, I'm really excited to be here. And I see also Kylie. Nice to see you. We just spoke the other day. Australia, the climate mobilization, the organization that I founded about 5 years ago, has since very, very early on, I mean, even actually before we got started, had this real relationship with Australia, who, for whatever reason, you all are really on the cutting edge of climate emergency thought leadership. And so it's been a really, really great synergistic relationship to, like on the climate emergency campaign, for example, that would really, is kind of like co-developed between our work and this group of organizations and thought leaders over here, such as Jane. And it's no surprise, Jane and I are both psychologists, right? So in therapy, if anyone has been in therapy, you think you can get better without telling the truth? Like, is that gonna, like, create any kind of transformative change? No. And so I fully agree with everything she said. And I want to talk about two applications of that idea. And the first is like the personal psychological, and the second is the organizational. Because the climate mobilization was founded on the ideas that Jane is talking about, with the explicit understanding that no one else is doing this, and therefore a new effort was necessary. So in April, I published a book, Facing the Climate Emergency, How to Transform Yourself with Climate Truth. It is a radical self-help book for people to reckon with the climate emergency, process and experience their emotions, and turn their pain into action. That's the critical thing. And so, as Jane was talking about, we have to tell the truth, but we also need to, like, face the truth. And this is a call of climate activists, so I assume that has happened for most people, to some varying degrees, but I think it's still worth hearing this because we talk so little about climate psychology. So reckoning with the truth is the first step, but that's not just intellectually, right? This is not just about reading articles. This has to be reckoned with on an emotional and spiritual and personal and social levels, right? This is compartmentalization and intellectualization are two psychological defenses that are activated even in people who understand intellectually that this is happening. So yeah, you got to feel your feelings. And this is true. I mean, this is like a broader psychological point, but you should relate to your all feelings and climate feelings with non-judgmental self-compassion. There's no benefit in trying to censor your feelings or punish yourself for them, even if they're, irrational. I'm so angry at that person, but actually it's really my fault. So I'm, whatever. I'm bad. It's wrong to feel that way. just doesn't, it's, yeah, take it from a therapist. It just doesn't help. So to welcome thoughts and feelings about the climate emergency, as opposed to as Jane was talking about on a systems level, this idea of we can't feel afraid. No, fear is wrong. No fear, right? We are strong enough to deal with this like adults, and to actually, of course we feel fear. We're talking about the apocalypse. We're talking about billions of people dying and society collapsing. The idea that we wouldn't be afraid is insane. And it comes from, I agree with what Jane said. I also think the culture of science, climate has been classed as a science issue. So, and scientists have told us a lot about it, and they do that in a certain style. And that does not mean that is the way that the movement has to react. So another emotion other than fear that is worth mentioning is grief. We grieve not only the people and species who have already been lost, but we also need to grieve the future that we thought we had. So speaking personally, my plan was to be a clinical psychologist and to have a family and to write books, and like, this is going to be a wonderful life. But then I had to grieve that plan when I came to terms with the reality of the climate emergency, that it's just, it's not going to happen. It's not going to be lovely. Like, you can't have a successful personal life and successful career while civilization is collapsing. It's just not going to be good. So, but grieving that path that I thought I was on, that I had invested a lot into, opens up a space for a new story of self. And so I challenge readers to reimagine your life story. What if your whole life was actually leading up to this? What if this is why you're here? And to just try to reinterpret, okay, what if, that experience that I had that was so hard, what if that was actually teaching me something that I'm using now? So the next step the book has 5 steps. We're on step 4 now. The next step is to understand and enter emergency mode. And that is the idea that there is a fundamentally different mode of functioning when there's an emergency, an existential emergency. If your house is on fire, you gotta react to that. You change what you're doing, you change your priorities, and you put out the fire. And this can also occur, this level of focus and prioritization, in a sustained way, and by individuals as well as collectives. So we can personally enter emergency mode and realize that climate activism is how we are going to keep ourselves and our families safe, and invest that work with that level of passion and dedication. I could say a lot more, but and then the other piece of that being that we need a World War II scale response from governments, meaning all hands on deck, whole society mobilization. The government takes a much stronger role in planning the economy. There's there's bans and other command and control regulations, such as banning all new fossil fuel infrastructure, banning factory farms, and a huge amount of spending. We advocate that the government should spend without limit to save as much life as possible. So chapter 5, final chapter, is join the climate emergency movement. So perhaps you're all got there already. I talk about how hard it is, frankly, to figure out your place in the movement. And I think it's as challenging as choosing your career and navigating that. So yeah, that's some thoughts on the personal implications of the fact that the climate truth, that we are in an existential emergency and that we should tell the truth about it. So how much time do I have to talk about the climate mobilization? Oh no.
I'd say as long as you like, Margaret, go nuts.
Okay. Okay, so the other application is, that I want to talk about is the organization. I appreciate Jane's introduction. I do think that we have been a pioneering organization that's really changed some fundamentals about how climate is talked about and what is considered doable and what's being advocated. We've changed the conversation and policy making in certain cases to a level that I would like to share with you some of our strategies because I think they're worth adopting. The organization was founded on the principles of telling the truth and treating the climate like the emergency that it is. And as part of telling the truth, advocating for a response to the emergency that would actually work. I think this is really important. And because again, I agree with Jane that it's depressing and confusing not to advocate something that would actually work. And people, it feels wrong. It's inauthentic. And it's just not strategically wise. So yeah, I propose a bright line for as campaigners to consider how to spend your time and energy and capacity. And that the bright line is, if fully implemented, would this policy set actually protect humanity and the living world? That doesn't mean you can't support a standalone piece of legislation that is like part of a larger vision. Like, for example, banning all new fossil fuel infrastructure. Obviously, we should support that as a standalone, even though it by itself wouldn't go all the way, but it fits into a schema that would. Whereas carbon gradualism, zero emissions by 2050 targets, which is what the Democrats in the United States are advocating right now, or carbon pricing, for example, would this actually protect civilization and the living world? And what we did that I think was so effective was create a platform that politicians could adopt. And then we pressured them to, I'm not even sure the right word is pressured. We invited them to, and we had to get their attention, which does take a little bit of meetings and, organizing some phone calls or whatever. But it's not like we built so much power that they had to take on this platform. It's rather that we built a platform that was good and based in reality. And some politicians realized that they actually wanted to take this on, such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, whose Green New Deal is built on this foundation. And we worked on it a lot behind the scenes. And Bernie Sanders, as Jane was saying, adopted the metaphor very, very early on, and then in his last presidential race, which just recently concluded, he put forth the platform of a $16 trillion World War II scale climate mobilization. Though, unfortunately, he also chose the suicidal timeline of zero emissions by 2050, which it's not only suicidal, it's also just ruins the metaphor. Okay, you do not have a World War II scale climate mobilization that lasts 30 years. That doesn't make sense. And it's just, yeah, multi-decade targets are really just about kicking the can down the road. I mean, because the timeline really isn't important. It's the mentality that's important. I mean, we needed to get to zero emissions like 20 years ago. And since we didn't, we need to get there as soon as humanly possible. And I don't know how long that's going to take. 10 years seems approximately right. Philip Sutton says we can do it in 6. Maybe it'll end up, maybe if we try to do it in 10, it'll end up taking 12. It doesn't, I mean, the point is as quickly as humanly possible, and 2050 is clearly the wrong mentality and approach. So one of the campaigns, our most successful campaign, or I mean, I guess you could say we have 2. One is the kind of general thought leadership campaign that I'm describing that has kind of introduced this paradigm into US politics in a very kind of strategic way. Like, I mean, for example, I mean, we're just like clever. Like, you know, the United States has this really weird electoral process for president that is so focused on certain states, Iowa and New Hampshire. So we hired one contractor in Iowa, and so he could go and meet with all of the candidates because they're like a year before the presidential election. It's just a really weird situation. So but so yeah, building a platform that is good, and by good I mean could actually protect humanity in the living world, and creates jobs, and makes a better and more just world, right? It would be possible to do a race to zero emissions that was made our society worse, right? Could make our infrastructure better, but like, you know, human relations worse. So we do have to make sure to bring like other values into this. But I do think that if we don't bring the emergency message and platform, I don't think we can really have other values truly. I mean, like, if we want to create a better world, we need to stop the climate emergency from fully unfolding, period. Okay, so
Yeah.
what else should I talk about? Oh, sorry. I know. Sorry. One more piece, and then I'll come back to that question. So then the other most important side of our campaigning is the climate emergency declaration campaign, which, as Jane said, Durban was the first city in the world to declare a climate emergency. And then we brought that concept to the United States and got like 10 cities to declare a climate emergency across the country, mainly in California. And then we passed it to Extinction Rebellion, we had kind of hooked up with them before they got big. So we were able to help them like shape strategy. And the idea of that, you know, and a core idea of these declarations is movements need to win things. This is where we are, and like this up here is what we need. And this is a really tough place for a movement to be, because you have to like be always building momentum, right? So most climate organizations deal with this gulf by saying, well, we'll take one step and then we'll take another step, and like eventually maybe we'll get there. But and that's how generally people approach politics, right? It's the art of the possible. But yeah, that's not going to work. So the climate emergency approach is like, okay, so we can't get here in one like leap, but we can at least define what it is with the government and have them officially acknowledge the situation. And again, talk is cheap compared to action. It is much, much easier for these governments to say there is a climate emergency and we're going to do something than actually do it. However, it's a good first step is to get that acknowledgement and commitment, and then you take the organizing core that achieved it, which is generally like a coalition of organizations locally that have come together around this campaign. You get that, then they hold the government accountable and they build more power. So yeah, there's some excellent examples of that working, that strategy working, such as in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is a city of 100,000 people, and they just unrolled their $1 billion climate plan to get to zero emissions by 2030 after declaring climate emergency. It's like those two things are tied together. So that's the best. Yeah. And then the other really strong concrete policy accomplishment coming out of those declarations is a series of cities, starting with Berkeley, California, have banned gas hookups in new construction, which is so obvious and in some ways such a low bar. But I mean, it's crazy right now. People are building new construction with gas hookups, and that the gas industry, we've seen industry reports from the gas industry just being like, where did this come from? We didn't expect this. This is, so that's cool.
Sorry to cut in, Margaret, but we want to try and get to some questions.
Yeah, totally. That's good. Let's do it.
Thank you so much for sharing all those tidbits. I think that's pretty interesting about how the coalitions actually force the change on the ground. But if we start with some questions, I think, first question that I had lined up, the person knows. Shoot.
Okay. Hi, Margaret. Thank you so much for your work. As you know, I'm also a psychologist. I'm a research psychologist. And so you've already spoken quite a bit to what I want to ask, but I'm hoping we can elaborate on it a bit further. So basically, as you've said, the climate emergency is now being discussed as an existential threat. And so in this context, I'm wondering, do you feel that the climate emergency could be considered a spiritual emergency? And what implications do you think this has with regards to climate justice? So for example, spirituality, particularly here in Australia, is still quite a marginalised concept. How do you think we can navigate this situation?
Yeah, I absolutely think it's a spiritual emergency. I think that's a word, and also climate justice, but are words that kind of mean different things to different people. But I think the climate emergency should call into question our fundamental ideas about what humanity is, what life is about, why we're here, what's good and evil. I think, like, to quote Naomi Klein, like, this changes everything, like, and that's, inside as well as outside. So I think, okay, so what does that have to do with climate justice, or how can that, I think the key thing for me is that we are in a time that demands transformation, not reform. And in the United States, it is totally clear that we need transformation in every area. And that is to deal with the climate emergency, and that's to deal with the fact that we have, the worst wealth inequality, I think maybe ever in our history, and extremely violent police force. So the idea of transforming our society, recognizing that our system right now is fundamentally broken. And so in terms of how we relate to politicians and to institutional leaders, if you start with that recognition that the system is fundamentally broken and we need transformation, not reform, it's just a totally different relationship, and it's a totally different level of responsibility that we're putting on leaders, which I think is absolutely right. I mean, so meaning if a politician tells you, if a politician's vision is to keep things more or less the same, no, that's not moderate, right? Like that's, or conservative, that it's suicidal. All right. So I know there's more questions, so I hope that sufficed.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Jane has a question actually following on from this.
Yeah, look, you started answering it, but maybe just a little bit more, because obviously this is an incredible moment, well, from so many different angles. But the whole Black Lives Matter thing that's gone around the world and is very strong here in Australia as well. So this transformative moment in terms of justice more broadly, do you want to just tell us some more about your thoughts about that? I know we had some very interesting conversations in Melbourne. You've got some great ideas, I think, about concretely what climate justice actually means.
Oh, yeah. There's so much to say. I think the one thing that I think we climate truth tellers need to bring to this conversation is the reality that if we don't get to zero emissions and draw down as quickly as humanly possible, I mean, we are going to see, I mean, truly a genocide of Black life and brown people and everyone eventually, right? That's like, I struggle a bit with the narrative of like that certain people are getting hit first and worst. Certainly, I mean, clearly, but I don't want rich white people to feel that this is not coming for them. I think that has been a barrier because it has, it allows people to whatever say, I'm fine. This is gonna kill other people far away. I think I mean, one way that I've been thinking about this is just what we need to achieve if we are going to get out of this absolute catastrophe is really a lot. I mean, it's a huge project, so much so that some people would tell you that it's impossible. I don't think so, but it's certainly huge. And to do that, we need to be a functioning society. And we're not like a high functioning society even. And right now in the United States, like we are not. Like we're, I mean, you know, it's like embarrassing, but I mean, the coronavirus, you know, is just unchecked, and huge amount of people are unemployed, and police are murdering Black people in the streets. So we will not be able to accomplish the kind of transformation we need if people are poor and, you know, not able to meet their basic needs. So I think that's one way that these struggles are absolutely wound up together. I don't know. There's much more to say. It's been extremely exciting to see. It feels rather spontaneous, this uprising, but it's not. It's a result of years of really good organizing. So I think there's that too, is to see what's possible.
No, thank you very much. We've got a question from Bill. Do you want to ask your question, Bill?
Given the lack of any moral leadership in Australia at a political level, in America, in many of the so-called developed Western countries, I find myself wondering, are there any insights that psychology can offer about how, if we're asking for a huge mobilization on a scale such as happened in World War II. Can psychology offer any insights as to how, if certain countries come on board with that, how that's going to impact or affect people who lead authoritarian regimes and the people who live under them? Sorry if this question's a bit
Whoa.
vague, but
so if we enter emergency mode, what's going to happen to like Brazil or what? I mean, do you have someplace in
Russia,
mind?
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have anything that immediately comes to mind. I mean, Eric Fromm is one of my favorite psychological authors, and he wrote Escape from Freedom, which is about why people are drawn to authoritarianism. And the basic idea is that, what freedom is actually really challenging psychologically, because we need to like make all these decisions and try to figure stuff out for ourselves. And it's easier to just kind of let an authoritarian just like subsume you. So that's, I mean, one thing that I think is critically important, and another kind of tie back to the justice and like racial justice, is like having a shared national mission is so good for like egalitarianism of all kinds. That so and yeah, like being on the same team pursuing a common project makes like inter-race relations, it improves them better than anything. So and like during World War II, there were a lot of steps forward in terms of civil rights and feminism and so forth. So but anyway, this isn't really answering your question. I guess the answer is I don't really know. Jane, do you know how authoritarian leaders are going to respond to mobilization?
I don't know, but I have just been reading that amazing book by the person who helped organize the Serbian revolution.
Oh, Sergei
Popovich. A lot of
Popovich.
stuff to say about organizing in authoritarian contexts and basically using very similar sort of techniques. Who can remember his name? Someone put it in the chat.
Sergei Popovich.
That's it, Popovich. It's a fantastic read. So look, but I think like the other thing I put in the chat about this earlier is, that idea that's quoted by Alcoholics Anonymous, but I think it's a Zen idea. Change what you can change. We can change what's happening here. It's very hard for us to change what's happening somewhere else. But if we lead by example with a bit of luck, it spreads all over the world. Extinction Rebellion is in 68 countries, including in lots of countries in Africa and lots of countries in Asia. And a whole lot of councils in South Korea just declared an emergency. That's South Korea. Eventually it'll spread hopefully to North Korea, Russia, and those places where it's much harder to organise. But we have to lead the way, and we have to do what we can do. We can't do what we can't do. So let go of that. Let go of that. I think that Zen sort of mentality that you do everything you can and then you let go. If it works, you go, beauty, it worked. And if it didn't, you still lie easy in your bed. You say, I did everything I could.
I agree with that. I think that one way we talk about our work at the Climate Mobilization is making the necessary possible. So rather than trying to achieve what is possible, it's just figuring out what needs to happen and just running towards that as much as possible. And also building outward, like almost no one is acting rationally and morally in response to the climate emergency, and like virtually no institutional leadership is. So it's like we can build power, I think, most effectively by going out in concentric circles. So first getting you know, all of the low-hanging fruit people into emergency mode, move them from being, you know, scared but silent into like, or campaigning. And then after that comes like, you know, whatever, in the US, the Democratic Party. And then after that comes the moderates and the conservatives or whatever. And then after that will come the authoritarian regimes. So anyway, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
So I just sort of one more thing too. My partner, who's a football enthusiast, quotes this example. I think it was the Hawthorn coach, and they were massively losing at 3/4 time. And apparently he just went and just sort of yelled at them, just do something, just do anything, just hand pass, just kick. Like, we don't know what's going to work. Just do something. And they did. And they won, you know. So I think if you tell the truth and just do everything you can think of, then you're going to end up with no regrets and hopefully something works.
Well, we're coming very close to the end of the time now, so perhaps we'll just take some final comments from Jane and Margaret. Or should we have one last question? 2 minutes. Do you have anything else you wanted to add, Margaret?
One thing that I just want to let people know is that you can get a free chapter of Facing the Climate Emergency at facingtheclimateemergency.com. I put that in the chat. And also, if you do read the book, I'd love to hear from you. We have a survey for readers to like talk back. So yeah, I hope that you read it and it helps you.
Yeah, I'm happy enough to make my just do something, just do anything but tell the truth comment, my final comment. So I don't know, we could squeeze in a 2-minute question, or we could knock off early, whatever you think.
Maybe we'll have a question from Coralie quickly.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for this discussion. It was really interesting. So my question is more a day-to-day thing, because this climate emergency is obviously going to be a very long battle. How do you reconcile emergency mode and your everyday life? So for instance, I'm personally finishing now my PhD. And so I keep shifting between my top priorities, writing my thesis, and then I feel guilty about, oh, you know, everything's going down and I'm not doing anything or enough for the climate. And then I'm doing more for the climate, and I talk to my supervisor and I'm feeling guilty about not writing my thesis. So how do you reconcile these two things?
Yeah, it's a very real issue, and it comes up all the time. It came up in the scheduling of this call because it's hard to do time zone things and like whatever. Will I do a call at 10 o'clock at night? And I said no. So I mean, that's one thing. I mean, certain kind of basic stuff, but like just taking care of your body, getting enough sleep, working out, and eating healthily. It sounds obvious, but like, I don't think some campaigners really short sell those things. So yeah, paying attention to your body is one. And it's also one that I really like because it doesn't require being in denial about the climate emergency. Like, I think some climate campaigners, including myself, find it a little bit hard to go to a party or some kind of socializing that feels like, are we in denial here? Is that, but yeah, I do it since doing climate campaigning. I started really doing like tough workouts, because if you work out hard enough, you can't think about anything else. But yeah, time is really the most important thing, right? It's an issue of how we manage our time and our energy, because once you're in it, once you have processed climate truth and have turned that into action, then there's never enough hours in the day, right? Like I joke, take responsibility for solving the climate emergency. You'll never be bored again. So it's, I think, and what's worked for me, but is to shift your life around however you can that gives you the most time for this work. And that's different for different people. Like a lot of people just have a job that they cannot leave because they have financial obligations to such a whatever to their family that they just feel like they can't, but they have to do this, and their climate work has to come outside of that. And you know, I understand that people have limits. However, if you can do something like move to 4 days a week, or part-time, or take a year off your school or whatever, or when people do that kind of thing, I'm always supportive. I don't say oh, but what about having enough balance or whatever, or what about your retirement savings or this kind of thing. I think it's worth it to, I made a pretty extreme choice, and which it means I put a lot of time and effort and money into getting a clinical psychology PhD, and then didn't practice because I wanted to do this instead. And I never, ever, ever regretted it. So yeah, that's what I think is try to shift as much time as you can. And sometimes there's is there overlap? Can you bring this work into your job or into your education, right? You're doing a thesis. Can it be on a climate topic? That kind of approach as well. And then the last thing I'll say, and I think this is a good way to end the call, is to have self-compassion and realize that nobody can do it all. I agree with Jane fully that you want to do everything you can, but there are limits to that. You can't do more than you can, or if you do for a while, then won't be able to soon. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Jane and Margaret, for your time, and everybody for being here. And the questions were really good. And I think there was lots of interesting comments and some resources shared in the chat window. So just a reminder, if you click on the little 3 dots in the chat window, you can save that chat and that'll capture those links. Otherwise, I think we'll say goodbye, and thanks everyone for coming here, and hope you learned something. And we'll make a YouTube video out of this as well so that people can share it around later on. But thanks very much for our speakers and for everyone being here.